Just quickly, just a quick summary of your background in terms of your credentials in terms of talking about the issue of energy.
All right. Well, I'm a lapsed academic. I was at Cambridge, actually in the humanities, until the early 2000s, when I started to take an interest in the energy sector. And I became involved with those people creating a new charity to publish data on the energy sector, called Renewable Energy Foundation. And I was brought in because I was an experienced researcher and also had very good contacts in the engineering departments around British universities. And I quickly taught myself the business. I'm not an economist or an engineer, but I have a reasonably quick learning curve and was able to pick up what I needed. And I've been doing that ever since 2004. And over the years, I published a great deal on the subject, and I still run Renewable Energy Foundation, and I write extensively now for British media, international media, and private clients as well. But my profile really comes through the charity Renewable Energy Foundation, which I direct, and which I designed to become the principal resource for straightforward empirical data on the performance and the costs of the renewables program in the UK. And we are still the best source of empirical data on the performance and the costs. There's nobody to match us in the UK.
Why is it so important to have solid data and costing data? Like, why is that your focus?
The renewables are a feel-good technology, and when sentiment intervenes, I'm afraid reason goes out of the window. So it's important to keep on dragging people back to the realities. And people want this to work, but the question is, does it? People want it to be cheap. The question is it? People want it to be environmentally satisfactory. They want it to be a viable climate policy. The question is, will it be affordable in the long term? Is this really sustainable? I mean, it's perfectly rational to have a climate policy. Is our climate policy rational is the big question, and my data helps you answer some of those questions.
When you entered into the field, what did you have preconceived notions at all? For instance, one of the most prominent North American activists in this area is Michael Schellenberger of California, and when he entered into it, he was a strong supporter of solar and wind, and a big player in the Obama administration's implementation of solar and wind programs, and he became disillusioned. Do you have a similar story, or what was your starting point in terms of what your thinking was initially?
Somewhat different. I was more skeptical about renewables than Michael was, but I felt that the industry was basically worthy, but probably overhyped. I became interested in it because we had a wind rush in the early 2000s, when wind companies were wanting to build wind farms in extraordinarily unsuitable places, and I couldn't understand why they were doing that. Being an academic, I assumed there was a document somewhere, text behind the whole business. So I went away and I read the subsidy legislation, the renewables obligation, and I very quickly realized that it was about above market prices and distorted markets. So at that point, I realized that this was a severely overheated sector. But at that point, I still felt that basically these were worthy technologies that were being driven too hard, too fast, and encouraged to go into areas where they simply weren't suitable or acceptable on environmental grounds. Over the years, I'm thinking more deeply about the physical character of the energy flows from both sun and wind. I've come to the view that actually these technologies are at best niche technologies, and that they are deeply and indeed wholly unsuitable to do the heavy lifting for a climate policy. I do think it's rational to have a climate policy, and although this will sound paradoxical to many people, I now think one of the principal obstacles to achieving sustainable and affordable carbon emissions reductions is the renewables industry. Until we get them out of the way, we're simply not going to be able to afford to do sustainable emissions reductions at a reasonable level in a reasonable time.
I want to build up to your explanations about why solar and wind are so popular and what's the problem with them. But I want to start with just some of the history that you've dug into in the past, the history of energy systems regarding past decisions made by previous generations and the fragility of our energy system. So if you could take us back, to the starting of the modern energy systems Um, what were the drivers, and how did that come up? How did our energy system that we have now, how did it come about essentially?
Well, it's much further back than most people realise. When people start thinking about the history of modern energy, they tend to think of its 18th century Britain as the classic industrial revolution. But the English industrial revolution is a misleading misnomer. It wasn't solely English, it was North European. It wasn't solely industrial, it affected every aspect of those societies. And it wasn't a revolution in any meaningful sense of the word, because it took several hundred years, and indeed it's still going on today. So there's no flip over, turnover in there. It's a very slow, gradual phenomenon going back several hundred years into the middle and late medieval period, when mineral fuels, such as peat and then coal, began to enter North European energy supplies in larger quantities. Holland had quite a lot of peat quite early, and therefore had a very different sort of economic character. They were one of the first divergent economies. Britain started to adopt coal in a very large way from the late 1500s through to the late 1600s. And by 1700, the year 1700, 50% of British total primary energy was coal, long before the classic industrial revolution. And what that meant was that you had a very productive energy source coming into the system. By productive, I mean that the energy return on energy invested is very high in comparison with organic energy sources such as land. Land was the principal energy source before that, growing food for human and animal muscle. Yes, there was some wind and some water, but it's fundamentally animal and human muscle fed by organic products from the land. Land is a very low productivity energy source. In fact, it's a renewable energy source, but it's very low productivity. Consequently, almost the entire economy prior to peat and prior to coal, was taken up with producing energy through the land. Even as late as the 18th century, by which time the economy had begun to diversify dramatically, many more employment types, many more jobs outside the energy sector. Even in the 18th century in Britain, 75% of the workforce worked on the land for the energy sector of the day, landowners. And that is very little appreciated outside specialist economic history circles. But it's a terrible warning about what might happen in the future if we go back to low productivity energy sources. There's a naive misconception about the likelihood of social progress and development of social equity with a renewable energy system. In fact, what's much more likely is that it will revert to the kind of social distribution of wealth and capital ownership that we had in the past, when the energy sector dominated the economy because it was very low productivity. There was hardly anything outside the energy sector. And those within the energy sector, land, had enormous socio-political power because they employed everybody and they owned nearly all the capital in the sector. So one of the biggest transformations in modern energy is this expansion of the non-energy sector and the expansion of non-energy employment types.
I want to ask you a couple of definitions. When you talk about low productivity energy, what do you mean by that?
I go back to the energy return on energy invested point.
Okay.
So you're putting in so many joules in your energy sector. You're ploughing the land and you're sending boys and girls out on it to scare the birds off the seeds once they sow them, and so on. There's quite a lot of energy going into the sector, and at the end of the year, you've got a harvest. Well, you've got a margin, a surplus, as the Marxists used to call it, a surplus over the energy that's gone into it. With organic systems, that surplus is quite small. It's just enough to, you've got just enough to produce seed for the next year and to produce some to eat, and a tiny little bit for economic growth, perhaps, tiny bit, but not enough to make that growth stable. So you're vulnerable to shocks, and that's the historical record of human societies going right back to the introduction of agriculture, 12,000 or so years ago, is that societies start growing and then they're hit by a shock. There's a bad harvest or something, and they're knocked back again. What happened with the introduction of fossil fuels was that it produced a stable, very high return on energy investment, which meant that growth could be sustained. And you can read all about this in works by the Cambridge economic historian Anthony Wrigley, E.A. Wrigley, who's published several books on this since the 1960s. Two most recent ones, he died quite recently, but his two most recent ones are Energy in the English Industrial Revolution, 2010, and The Path to Sustained Growth, which I recommend very strongly to anybody interested in the role of energy in social change and economic growth.
So when an energy surplus for a society is just very small, like when the energy in is here, and then the energy that you create from it is just very close to it, you're susceptible then to famine, all kinds of shocks that can really, because it can quickly go out of whack, and you can have big trouble in
That's
your
right.
society.
Your energy sector is fragile, indeed your society is fragile as a result. Whereas with high surpluses, obviously you can grow, your economy grows dramatically, and you can stockpile, you can prepare for the future, and indeed you can make your entire system more robust. Your flood defences are better, your houses are more robust against weather freaks, and you can store food.
Is there do you know, in terms of is there a number on how much more, like an order of magnitude, that coal is in terms of energy productivity over a land, kind of a agricultural energy system?
Yes, I'm afraid I cannot remember it offhand, actually,
Okay.
but Anthony Wrigley has a very interesting figure on the energy productivity of a coal miner as opposed to an agricultural worker.
Okay.
And it's not a decimal point fraction over, it's 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, depending on the coal source, but it's many times more productive than the agricultural sector.
So having coal then allowed Northern European societies to do what? What were the changes then that came out of that?
Well, they were able to create more improbable states of matter. I mean, this is my own particular interest in this whole debate. Philosophically, I'm basically an academic and something a philosopher, I suppose you'd say, if anything, really. I'm interested in the relationship between energy and the theory of wealth. Economics is a funny field. It's macroeconomics, at any rate. It's about the distribution of scarce resources to maximize the production of wealth. But the field doesn't have principal definitions of scarcity or resource or even wealth. And I find that rather puzzling and unsatisfactory. So I want to niggle away at that and get a better understanding of it. And the view I've come to is that wealth should simply be understood as an improbable state of matter in relation to human requirement. And how do you create improbability? Well, you use energy, of course, to do that. And if you have a society working with what are high entropy energy sources, which are low productivity ones, you can't create very much additional improbability beyond that required to run the energy system. That was the organic society we've just been describing. If you have a very productive system, you can create many more improbable states of matter in relation to human requirements. Or, to put it more technically, you can drive the whole of human society, the whole human sphere, further and further away from thermodynamic equilibrium until it becomes extraordinarily improbable and indeed comfortable and beneficial, as modern societies are. And we owe that improbability many of the things that we associate with social and political progress: tolerance, general kindness and willingness to accept that people wish to satisfy their wishes rather than trying to repress them all the time.
I want to go back to definitions. This idea of improbable state of matter. Could you explain that? It's kind of an abstract concept. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, if you look around you, in my room, for example, you have an enormous amount of material in it, which would not happen simply by shaking matter vigorously and waiting for a while. You'd have to wait for an awfully long time to get this room around me by chance. And that's true of the entire human sphere. And it's what we want. It's the thing. These are the states of matter that actually suit our requirements rather than being hostile to us.
So it's improbable, this room just coming about by happenstance.
By chance, yeah.
So wealth is the accumulation of these improbable states of matter, which we actually create ourselves.
That's right. Correct? And our societies are becoming progressively more and more improbable, since since we walked out of Africa, and societies in Africa have been on the same track as well. So there's been a very long-term growth in improbability over time, which it continues. There is, of course, a question about will it continue? Many societies in the past have gathered up a great deal of improbability and have then fallen back quite a long way. Is that going to happen to us? Well, it might do. It's quite conceivable that it will, unless we can maintain the energy supply. Because once you've climbed this kind of Mount Improbable, you've got a slight problem, which is you have to keep on maintaining it. The mountain just stays there, but in fact states of wealth don't. they're always returning to, slipping back towards thermodynamic equilibrium. Entropy tends to increase. So we're always repairing our system. It's not simply a question of banking it and resting on it. You never get a moment where you sit down and have a rest. You're always having to repair what you've already accumulated as well as adding to it. So you need a very high quality energy supply, which is stable and I suspect increasing. I suspect that actually you have to have an increasing energy supply in order to have a stable system. I'm skeptical about the view that we could reach a state where you have homeostasis, where you have a stable society which doesn't grow. I suspect that the lesson from complex systems is that they tend to be stable only under the condition of expansion. So we shall have to find a way of making sure that we can grow and become more improbable without becoming damaging to our own well-being.
So how did we do in the 20th century in Northern Europe, North America, in terms of creating a stable energy system? What did we do? How did we measure up there?
It went pretty well, actually. The system started pretty much dependent on coal at the end of the 19th century. The United States, by that point, was really a wood economy. Very interesting system in the US, but they used British coal technology, steam engines, to burn wood. So even in 1900, 50% of American energy over the 19th century was actually derived from timber. But of course, they accumulated sufficient very improbable states to become a highly sophisticated economy very early, indeed in the early 19th century. They were already a very sophisticated economy. And by the late 19th century, of course, they had developed oil and were developing the technologies that were necessary in very improbable states of matter, engines and so on, in Europe too, to actually burn these fossil products. So coal to oil, and then of course the natural gas started to be used in larger quantities, and nuclear energy through the 20th century. So the general shift there is from higher entropy sources, first of all the organic energy sources, then the lower entropy sources in coal, and then lower still in oil and gas, and then nuclear. So we've been making a progressive improvement here. It's going pretty well. And the cost of energy was coming down because it's more and more productive. And this is very good for people because they can live better and better lives. And you see this in basic indices of mortality and health. It's very simple. I mean, one of my specialities is literature. I mean, anybody who's read the literature of the past will know that the death of children is a standard feature in human experience up into well into the 20th century, when the death of a child is a very unusual experience now in the rich, developed economies, which means that when it does happen, it's truly tragic and devastating for the couples who experience that loss, and very painful indeed, because it's precisely because it's now so unusual. So pretty good, I would say, in overall. The energy system has becoming cheaper, more productive, and also, and this is an important point for environmentalists to remember, much, much cleaner. The thermal efficiency of the coal stations was improving steadily through the early 20th century, right up until the 60s and 70s, when the last big stations were built in Europe. And then with the gas stations, of course, the story starts again. Thermal efficiency of gas turbines is improving rapidly, even today. They're getting more and more efficient. So it's getting cleaner and cleaner and cheaper. And this is a very, very an admirable story, a story of successful engineering and economics well deployed to to further human well-being.
What kind of attitudes then drove this kind of very efficient increase in the stability and productivity of our energy systems in the 20th century?
Well, that's one of the most remarkable things about it. There was no central planning involved. This was simply the system, individuals within the system, making straightforward economic decisions, say, selecting superior energy sources because they were cheaper, and therefore they could make a profit. There was no bright spark in Whitehall or in Paris suddenly saying, we've got to do this. No, it just happened because people spontaneously selected better and better energy sources. And the improvements in thermal efficiency for coal and gas stations were driven by straightforward economics. They wanted to improve the cost efficiency of their systems. And the centralization, creation of central electricity grids too, was driven by that, although that was a centrally planned matter here in the UK, as you might imagine, from 1926 on, the Weir Committee report. So there's some government involvement in the creation of grid networks, but the selection and improvement of individual technologies, this is basically private enterprise.
So there was no Kyoto or Paris Energy Accords early in the century where some central planners and big thinkers got together and told us all what to do. That did not happen with energy. It just
There
Okay.
wasn't, and one has the sort of suspicion that had there been, things would not have gone as well.
All right. Okay. So we have this incredible increase in energy um, productivity, stability, and where are we headed now? Like, how are we doing now?
Well,
How did that
we
change?
have, yes, well, there are several changes here, and things have taken a downturn, and largely because we've allowed governments to start to plan the energy systems. And this, in Britain certainly, this dates from, and in Europe generally, dates from the 1990 or thereabouts. This is when the first conference of the parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change took place, and the decision taken that we had to decarbonise. Now, as I noted, actually, we were already cleaning up our energy system at that time by reducing the input from coal, which was being superseded by high efficiency gas turbines in Europe and particularly in Britain. Now, so we were already on track to decarbonise the economy. And my own view is that we were on track to go from gas to nuclear, which would have been a sustainable decarbonisation trajectory. But instead, in the late 1990s, it was decided that we had to introduce renewables to decarbonise. Now, that I think is the fatal error. As I said, initially, I didn't really see this myself. I just thought they'd been overhyped, but I thought they were worthy technologies and correctly deployed. But I now think that was a serious mistake. It was an error of thermodynamics. It was a failure to recognise that the input to renewable sources is of very high entropy. It's close to random heat. It's very probable. There's very little improbability in the fuel. So it needs a huge amount of correction to turn it into an acceptable energy supply comparable to that derived from very low entropy, high quality sources such as oil, gas, and coal. And that makes renewables intrinsically expensive, very, very expensive, in fact.
What do you mean when you say it's close to random heat? What does that mean?
Random heat, the most probable state of heat, where heat is evenly distributed through a system. There are no heat gradients, no energy gradients left to do work. So this is when the heat is dissipated out to its maximum, and you can't do anything else. It's just a stable.
Is one way to look at it to produce a barrel of oil, and all the energy that comes out of the oil takes a small amount of energy compared to what you get out of it. But
Yes.
to produce the amount of energy you get from solar power or wind, it takes this much energy, and it's very similar to what you get out of it. Then, so we're almost back to what we had when we were getting our energy from agricultural sources. Is that one way to frame it?
Yes, we've gone back down the energy return on energy invested curve to much lower returns. They're still positive, I'm prepared to believe, in many cases, though perhaps not all, actually. One does wonder about solar in Britain. Solar energy in Britain, one thinks that's intrinsically really quite strikingly improbable. What a strange thing to do. But they are positive, but they're not positive enough to make the system really high productive. They're much more like the agricultural systems in the past, which were positive, but only just. So they're going to be very expensive. They're going to come to dominate the economies which they power. So the future I see for economies which persist in this renewable agenda is that the overall economy will tend to shrink. The energy sector will tend to shrink as well, but it will expand as a proportion of the whole economy. So the renewables sector will come to dominate the economies of the future if we persist in it, which is, of course, in question. I mean, I like to say sometimes that if you think big oil was a problem, wait till you've seen big green. Big green will be really threatening and oppressive.
How so?
Because it will be like the aristocratic and landed systems of the past. It will dominate the economies. There'll be very little room for anything else. We'll all be working for the renewables sector on low incomes.
How did this take off then? How did this idea of solar and wind take off in the late 1990s? Why was there such enthusiasm and embrace of it?
I think it largely comes out of the oil shocks of the early 70s. There was a belief that we had to get away from fossil fuels, and also a failure amongst economists to recognize that it was fossil fuels that had been so liberating to human beings. They hadn't really understood what caused growth. I mean, Tony Wrigley was writing about these things at the time, and others too, actually. He's not alone. There are many people who've been on this track and trying to work it out. But mainstream economics had not realized how important high productivity, low entropy sources of energy were to economic growth and indeed social change, beneficial social change. So there was a suspicion of the enormous wealth of the oil companies. And of course, the oil shocks made people feel that they had to get away from that. So there was enthusiasm for renewable energy in Europe at the time, and the industry started at that time, particularly wind in Denmark, which is where it began. By the late 1990s, they were still very primitive, but there was still this feeling that this would be an ultimately wonderful thing to do to get Europe off the hook of fossil fuels, not realizing how socially liberating the fossil fuel economy had actually been for ordinary people. And of course, to that, you have to add the fact that wind turbines have this peculiar, iconic structure. They suggest simultaneously a crucifix and a flower, sacrifice and redemption and rebirth, all in one cozy package. They're a spin doctor's dream.
I just see them as big bird killing machines now, so I don't share that feeling. So you said we were on track for moving from gas to nuclear. How do we get off that track?
In order to introduce a fundamentally uneconomic set of energy sources such as wind and latterly solar, we've had to coerce the markets dramatically. So we've had to give the renewable technologies guaranteed market share, guaranteed prices, and all sorts of other regulatory favors, avoided costs, cost-free grid connection, they've been spared their balancing costs, and so on and so forth. So what we've done is we've dramatically reduced the productivity of our energy sector. And that has actually had a tremendous effect on the energy consumption profile of those economies that have done this to themselves. So if you look at the energy consumption curves for the Western economies, they're on a steady increasing energy curve, not dramatically increasing, but steadily increasing up until the early 2000s, which is when the introduction of renewable technologies began to become of significant levels. And then the economic crisis in 2008 hit, and there's a drop in energy consumption from which we have not recovered. And energy consumption in the OECD is overall, and in every state I've looked at in any detail, is now falling. So here in the UK, for example, we're now back at energy consumption levels that we haven't seen since the 1990s. And that is even true in the United States. Now you can look at the curves. You can go onto the International Energy Agency site. Now, that's generally true, but it is particularly true of electricity, and that is fascinating. Electricity is a very superior energy carrier. It's a kind of index of sophistication, really, and a healthy, good economy should be electrifying every process it possibly can economically. But our electricity consumption is now falling in the UK, and it's falling in many economies too, where they have introduced renewables, because the renewables frequently and mostly are attached to the electricity networks, and have therefore created economic distortions, coercions, and cost increases in those areas. So in effect, what we've done is to export, in particularly industrial consumption, to those parts of the world which are still using fossil fuels. And our carbon consumption has gone too. So people say that the UK or Europeans generally have reduced their emissions. Well, they haven't really. They've exported them to Asia. Carbon dioxide has been one of our most successful exports of recent decades.
So with nuclear, why move away from nuclear then? Why not? If we need this baseload abundant power, which is also lower emissions, why not this mad embrace for nuclear then in the 1990s? And that's why wasn't that the future?
It didn't happen. Margaret Thatcher had a plan for several nuclear reactors in the UK. Only one of them got built, not very far from where I'm now sitting, actually, in Suffolk. Well, there are several reasons for that, and some of them are actually understandable. I can see why environmentalists are concerned about large-scale nuclear reactors. There are reasonable concerns about them. And of course, there's the association with the weapons program, and much of the nuclear development from the 50s onwards was concerned principally with nuclear. Military nuclear, and only, I suppose you'd say, as a desirable offshoot and byproduct of it with civil nuclear. So there's a strong association with the weapons program in the public mind, which is now mistaken. It's clear that civil nuclear is an extremely attractive option. This is a very low entropy energy source. It's the logical next step. Once you've accumulated lots of societal complexity, all these wonderful improbable states of matter and mind, then you should be moving on to another energy source, which is truly difficult. Nuclear is a difficult energy source because it's so good, because it's so improbable. But it is tricky, and it will take time. I like to say to people that although it seems as if nuclear is a a very mature technology. In some sense, it's still very early in the development of this system, and we're making very good progress, but it takes time. And the steam engine was the same. The first steam engines came in the 1690s. They weren't really good until the 1890s. It takes time. These things take time to develop. But nuclear is very promising. Do I think we should continue with large nuclear reactors, such as the 1.2 gigawatt generator Sizewell B, not very far away from me? No, I'd like to see smaller devices. I think they're inherently much safer, and of course they're cheaper on a grid system. So one of the costs of Sizewell B is that it's the largest credible loss of load on the system, or was until recently, when the very large wind farms started to appear. But that means that the system has to carry enough reserve to cope with Sizewell B tripping. Well, that's quite expensive. So I think smaller nuclear stations distributed through the grid would be much more attractive. I'm also very interested in high temperature gas cooled reactors to produce high grade heat for industrial process. Electricity in some ways not really the most interesting market in energy. High grade heat is fascinating, and because once you've got high grade heat, you can do anything you want. I mean, it's the universal, it's the Swiss army knife of energy. You can do absolutely anything once you've got really high temperatures, 700, 900 degrees C. So small modular reactors producing industrial process heat, and also thermal decomposition of water to produce hydrogen as a supplementary energy carrier for electricity, because electric vehicles are not going to be able to do all the transport things we want. Moving away from oil and the internal combustion engine is really going to be very, very difficult indeed. EVs are simply not going to be able to do all of that. And so if we want to do that, we want to reserve the oil for other uses. It's a tremendous industrial chemical product, input fuel. If we want to do that, we'll have to use hydrogen, I suspect. And electrolysis of fresh water with electricity is a very foolish way to make hydrogen. It's extremely expensive. You should use the electricity directly. And the burden on the fresh water supplies is quite honestly unacceptable in relatively low rainfall areas. So thermal decomposition of seawater with high temperature nuclear reactors, small ones, sounds to me a very promising thing. I can't promise it's going to work, but we should certainly be looking into it. And with those nuclear reactors and this sort of mixed gas to nuclear strategy, I think we've become sufficiently sophisticated to start thinking seriously, and indeed many people are thinking seriously about fusion, which is the next step on beyond nuclear fission. And it's a still more sophisticated way of accessing low entropy states in the matter around us.
How much do you think of the push for solar and wind now is about companies that are deeply invested in this, wanting to make a lot of money and working hard to push their competitors to the side and push themselves forward? How big is the kind of the follow the money aspect of this driving forward solar and wind at this point?
At the macro investment level, it's all about money. Yes, there are private individuals putting up panels and small wind turbines on their small holdings and farms for the fun of it. But that's just hobbyist energy. It's insignificant in quantity, and I'm not going to try and stop people doing that. They sometimes do get subsidies for those things, but that's probably not the reason they're doing it. And indeed, they may be disappointed because, as it turns out, the operations and maintenance costs for those sort of things are very high. But the macro investment patterns are entirely determined by above market prices and guaranteed market shares. And to give you an example, in the UK at the moment, the subsidies to renewable energy are now over £10 billion per year. So this is approximately $13 billion a year. Now, for a country of 65 million people, that is quite a lot of money annually, actually. So the fact that the renewable sector has grown dramatically is completely unsurprising. You could have an awful lot of anything you choose if you're going to throw that much money at the sector. Anything which is completely counter-economic will happen, provided you subsidize it to that kind of level.
In Canada, where we've had a outstanding nuclear industry for a long time, and low carbon energy in Ontario, especially, I think it's about 60% of the electricity is produced by nuclear power plants. There is a lot of support for nuclear, but it's hasn't grown in a long time, and it's kind of so. the new climate change minister, Stephen Jabot, says, well, he has been an anti-nuclear, he was in Greenpeace, he was an anti-nuclear protester most of his adult life. And his line now is, well, he's a strong backer of solar and wind. And he says, well, nuclear just doesn't compete economically. We will let the market decide. How can you, when someone says something like that, how would you unpack that comment? Like, how do you take him saying that now, that we've got to let the market decide, and solar, and the obvious conclusion he's suggesting is that solar and wind will beat out nuclear? What would you say to that that comment from him?
The markets are very rarely undistorted, and in this particular case, what looks cheap almost certainly isn't. We have similar sorts of claims about renewables now being cheap in the United Kingdom, but they simply aren't. We go off to the audited financial statements and look at them, and we find that their capital costs are extremely high, as they always were. Their operations and maintenance costs are extremely high, as they always were. And the system management costs, that's the cost of rectifying the low quality of energy that they're producing, all the complex grid instructions that the system operator has, these are extremely high too. And indeed, there's no question that if we had an undistorted market, we would slip straight back onto the gas to nuclear track, because these are fundamentally stable systems that don't require special coercions and lots of special instructions to manage them. I'll give you an example of this. I mean, straightforward economic data from the UK. In the early 2000s, before we had many renewables on the system management balancing costs were about 300 to 400 million pounds a year. It's quite a small cost in relation to the overall sector. The total cost now is somewhere between 2 and 3 billion pounds a year. It's growing quite fast. And I can't say all of that is down to the addition of wind and solar, but most of it is. And this is the cost of turning a sow's ear into a silk purse, the sow's ear of wind and solar into the silk purse of reliable electricity provision for a modern economy. So your minister's observations that the market would choose wind and solar if undistorted, quite wrong. But he probably knows, and his advisors know, that your markets are not undistorted at present, and therefore the residual distortions would encourage people to carry on investing in wind and solar, even though they are actually very expensive for consumers.
When you talk about the balancing costs derive from what? Is this trying to keep a stable supply of electricity at all times, and the cost it keeps to fire up this plant, descale that plant, like balance it all out? Is that where the costs come from?
Yes. So wind is highly variable over all timescales, from seconds through to decades. So to guarantee security of supply, you need to have dispatchable power equivalent to your peak load plus a margin. So in essence, you haven't really changed your conventional system at all. It's just sitting there. What you're doing is underutilizing it. You've reduced the productivity of the overall system, going back to the original points we made. But to guarantee security of supply, you have to have a conventional system running in parallel, or ready to run. But it's underutilized, so it's expensive. Simple as that. And of course, sun doesn't shine at night, so you've got to be able to cope with periods when your solar generators are completely offline. The wind, of course, varies unpredictably, so sometimes you can predict it reasonably well at some levels, but then you've got a large error. And the largest credible error is still very large. So the wind error forecast means that you've got to have sufficient conventional plant to bring on quite quickly to deal with wind forecast errors or unexpected drops in wind or solar output, as occasionally happens. And that rapid introduction of new power is very expensive. You have to pay for it in the short term.
So you have to have this full backup system, and it has to be ready to go at the click of a finger. And these are the balancing costs. This is essentially the reason they're going up.
To which you can add transmission, network, and use of system costs, because in order to integrate large bodies of renewables, you not only need to have the shadow conventional system ready to kick in at short notice to guarantee security of supply, but you've got to have a lot of extra network in there to connect all the distributed renewables and the distant wind farms, the solar farms. So you've got much more underutilized capital in the grid network as well. So it's in addition to the balancing costs, you've got the transmission network costs, also rising very sharply in the UK.
So in Canada, the talk now is to go heavily into solar and wind, and the federal they are fanatically pursuing this course of action. Where will we end up then in Canada if we head down this path?
It's going to end in tears. for somebody. Uh, this will not persist. I mean, these are fundamentally unsuitable technologies to power a modern economy. So at some point, the costs will become intolerable. And these are, in a sense, they're classic Veblen goods. These are things that rich societies do to show off and to demonstrate goodwill. But at some point, you can't afford these kinds of luxury goods. And you realize that actually your well-being is being eroded by an unsatisfactory energy supply, and you're going to switch back to a truly viable system. In other words, a low entropy, highly productive system. When will that happen? I don't know. It could happen. People will go on paying for luxuries for quite a long time, indeed perhaps too long. They should cut back earlier, but they don't. Well, at some point we'll do it, and it could happen very suddenly. I know that there are people in the city who are beginning to talk about the coming crunch for renewables. This bubble will burst, and there are fund managers actively developing shorting strategies to take advantage of that when it happens. So market hygiene will prevail at some point. What I want to see is this happen through a process of rational debate, and we don't have to wait for a crash in the renewable sector. We ought to be sufficiently clever to see that this experiment has failed. We made a mistake. These were fundamentally unsuitable technologies. We've got far too many of them on the system. The costs are already intolerable. We should start winding them down, getting them off the system, start returning to the gas to nuclear track on which we were. And I hope Canada does something similar.
Can we afford to make, like Western societies, are we rich enough that we can actually afford to make this kind of massive mistake? What are the consequences for us of this?
We've made it.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, we made the mistake. Has it damaged us? Yes, I'm convinced. I'm sure it has. Our falling energy consumption tells you that there's something wrong, and it may be of geostrategic significance. After all, there are countries in Asia which have not made this mistake, and they have benefited enormously in comparative terms. They've become comparatively much richer and more powerful. But it's not too late for us to change course. Yes, we'll have suffered a relative loss to the wealth we could have created. There's no question about that. We're going to be poorer in the future than we would have been had we not made these renewable energy mistakes. But we have a lot of accumulated sophistication still in our societies. We're not collapsing yet. And so it's not too late to turn around and to fix this, but it's going to be tricky. There's already consumer hardship in the UK because of this. £10 billion a year on the bill is not a small quantity, and that's the national electricity bill. So it's electricity and general cost of living. So it's all over the place in your household accounts and bills. It's the long-term damage is worrying. I am concerned about that, but it isn't too late to fix it.
Because a country like China they're building, I understand, 165 nuclear plants. I don't know how many nuclear plants are being built in Northern Europe and North America. It's not anywhere close to 165. They're building coal plants at a record rate as well. Like they're just going in terms of all of these energy systems that give you high productivity energy. They're going whole hog, and we're sitting thinking, well, let's build another wind farm and another solar. I find it. I wonder why are we doing this?
Yeah. Well, why haven't we woken up to it?
Yes.
It's really educational. I've lived in Asia, and the prestige of engineers in the Asian societies is much higher. And the engineer bureaucrats of Beijing probably understand the conversation we've just been having much better than the lawyers in Washington or London or in your own capital states. I suspect that they know quite a lot of this, actually. The Asian economies and the economists and historians have been studying Western growth very carefully because they wanted to know what made it happen. And I suspect they got there before we did, that they realized that actually this was really about healthy energy systems. And so they focused on it. Now, China's case is very interesting. People sometimes point to the enormous quantities of wind and solar that are being built. Well, by European standards and North American standards, they are quite large, tens and 20s of gigawatts of wind. It sounds like a lot, but then you realize that their overall electricity system is thousands of gigawatts of coal. I mean, this is a trivial window dressing element for the economies and systems of this scale. My suspicion is that they're simply decorating the economy with a few wind turbines and solar panels. They're really planning on doing the proverbial end run around renewables. They'll move from fossil to large-scale nuclear, as indeed we should.
What do you think will be the wake-up call for us then? Like, we've made this mistake, as you say. What will be the thing that will get us to move?
Acute consumer hardship, and I think it's coming quite soon.
What does that look like? Okay, go ahead.
It's going to, it'd be when energy becomes such a large fraction of your household expenditure, when industries simply cannot afford to operate. People don't have jobs because the industries are closing down. The energy costs are too high. They're migrating to Asia and large scale. This is where it's going if we persist. But I think the costs are already very high, and a little bit more probably is tolerable to people if they believe that they're doing good. But there will come I think there genuinely will be a turning point. I'm generally skeptical about discontinuities in economics, but they do exist. I think there will be a tipping point in costs actually for households, but it won't simply be the electricity bill, as it were, or the gas bill. It'll be the overall cost of running an economy on low productivity sources means that everything becomes dramatically more expensive. And people will say, why has this happened? And the answer will be, well, because we have a very poor and unreliable energy system.
In Canada, we are in the grips of a federal government which believes in the solar wind solution, perhaps more than any government on earth right now. They are truly true believers that this is the right way to go. So I appreciate your message, and I don't. We'll see how it goes here in Canada. I think that right now the government in UK is shifting back to nuclear, as I understand it. Many of the European countries are. There does seem to be more movement in there than there is in Canada.
There certainly is recognition that nuclear is now a very important part of the future. I think we're only slowly realizing that in order to get sustained nuclear regrowth, we're going to have to undistort the markets. So we're going to have to declutter them, get rid of a lot of the renewables progressively to make room for a truly efficient system. I don't know the situation in Canada very well. I do understand the interest and the enthusiasm for it, and I genuinely understand it. I just think it's a mistake. But let's hope that reason prevails and that your decision makers begin to see that actually the well-being of the Canadian people depends on a high productivity energy sector rather than a feel-good one.
I notice I've been reading the stories on Rolls-Royce and their small modular reactors that are in the works. In Canada, we also have a small modular reactor program, which is building a test reactor right now. But it looks like the Rolls-Royce program is more advanced at this point. So,
well, the Rolls program it's actually they're half-size PWRs. They're 400 to 500 megawatts. So I'm actually much more interested in the Canadian machines and in the Japanese ones, which are sort of 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, genuinely small, genuinely modular.
Alrighty, well, this is what I wanted to ask you. I'm just wondering if you had any other thoughts or anything that you would like to add.
I think we've talked about life, the universe, and everything, haven't we? And as far as energy is concerned, I can't. My mind goes a blank when you ask me that question. Think of anything else.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. Thanks very much.
Great pleasure. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.